Alrighty, this is leading governments, following governments, and ignoring governments. And we're going to focus a lot on how to ignore governments because it takes a lot of attention to ignore something. For many people, finances are among their primary focuses. People may focus on their own financial practices as well as focus attention on the financial practices of others, such as the politicians active in the state government where they live, or the Federal Reserve, or OPEC, or the IRS, or whatever. Of course, people can focus on a few things in sequence, right? The sequential exposure can contribute to adaptiveness or learning, to intelligence, and to breakthrough results. My promise to you, if you choose to read and expose yourself to the following video, is not only a new and profound clarity and peace of mind, and possibly joy, as it relates to the various operations of human government, like clarity and peace of mind and joy, but access to breakthrough results for yourself that are already available to you, are already available for you if you simply notice how very simple your experience of governments could be. Now, I notice that some people, including myself, may argue about various behaviors, including the financial practices of government, like what's the right thing to do for them people to do. Which government should pay for what? Like, should the local people, or the federal people, or the state people, or the foreigners, or the... I know it should be the rich people. That's the universal. The rich people, wherever they are. If they're in New York City, then the New Yorkers should pay for it. You agree?
I agree.
All right. So how should they pay for those things? That's the other thing, is how should the New Yorkers that obviously owe me a lot? Because I'm a minority. Because I'm not a New Yorker. All right. How should they pay for it? I'm going to help them figure out, should they raise what tax or whatever. So one of the most popular ideas in mainstream culture and public schools is the idea that governments are the primary influence on how humans live. You got that? That's a popular idea, that governments are the primary influence on how humans live. And obviously the influence of governments can change with a higher frequency than the influence of molecular biology, which is pretty consistent, like generation to generation it might change. But governments can change stuff quickful, sudden-like. And solar radiation, it's seasons and day and night. Governments can change stuffs in quickful. So solar radiations and molecular biologies, which is symbolized by this motion, they they may only change slowly or very rarely. So it's not surprising that people might focus so much attention on changing practices of governments, right? Because the governments change stuff one election to the next, one administration from the next, right? So governments may actually have much less influence on human lives than the laws of molecular biology, the so-called laws of gravity or radiation or whatever. But people focus a lot of attention sometimes on these human statutory types of laws and so on, common law, all that kind of stuff. People might focus on that, social psychology and all that, because those things can change quickly. People can go from the optimisms to the pessimisms. Pessimisms? Pessimisms. Okay, good. But do governments primarily lead or primarily follow? Consider that governments primarily lead in some cases, but primarily follow in other cases. Clearly, the people administrating human governments may be surprised by various developments and then react to those developments, right? Reflexive stuff. By which I mean this: they may follow or respond to things that they did not directly cause, right? Or they at least may not have expected, because they're paying attention to gravity. They know about gravity and they know about molecular biologies, but governments they do different stuff at different times, and it's all confused. And people get all surprised. So it's understandable that that can happen, right? So one example of governments responding or following is what happens after the average automobile collision. That's the sound of a gun, but it symbolizes automobile collision. So there's a collision, right? And then government officials respond to reports of this collision, at least an alleged collision. And then they may interview survivors and witnesses and then do stuff like arranging for the clearing of the public roadways, right? And the government officers may request expert medical assistance as well as hire a private company to tow away the vehicles from the roadway, right? So it's clear for other peoples to like transit their cars. So generally the cops on the scene of the accident, see, they did not personally plan and implement the collision itself. They're just responding to it, right? They have a first responder type of thing set up. Okay, so they simply planned to be available for an emergency, and then they responded once they received a report of a certain new development for which they may or may not be well trained to handle, but they're like available and they're going to do what they can. And some people are going to complain about it, like in the accident or whoever, like, oh, they're in my way to trap those people. It's not the people who had the collision, it's the government, the cops there to slowing down traffic, and maybe they are, whatever. That's probably, in fact, kind of like what cops do with like the go this way and stop and traffic signals and all that. But if people like get delayed and they're surprised by their delays, they can blame on stuff. Because that's what people do when they're surprised sometimes, is blame on stuff. She looking at me weird. So now, how did such policies of responsive governments develop? In the case of responding to auto wrecks, as automobile travel became popular and auto collisions began to occur and then increase in frequency, like popcorn, like gets faster, right? So there's more and more automobile travels, right? And more automobile collisions. So they increased in frequency, and then various local governments developed these reactive programs, reflexive, reactive, responsive programs to receive reports, as well as proactive programs to like organize traffic flows, like with traffic lights and stop signs and all that, to reduce the frequency of automobile collisions while promoting safe and efficient travel. So in other words, government programs followed technological advances, or what we might call science. So what happened first was a technological advance, such as the discovering of fossil fuels and the manufacturing of automobiles, stuff like that. And then next, private citizens gathered together to organize businesses and associations to advance new technology. And eventually, more private citizens got involved, and soon government officials developed some role in the reorganizing of human life around the new technological advance. You can't know this. So later, some people might argue about which policies should government officials practice, right, and implement and enforce and stuff like that. So in fact, many people might argue over such things. I might have at some point in my life. So, but besides arguing and such, other people, a few of them maybe, however, see, they might focus instead on new policies. Nope, sorry, new possibilities, not possibilities, policies. New possibilities in their private activities, like they could research for new technological advances and such. So a few private researchers, they might revolutionize science and society, right? They might do developings of new technologies. So that could involve anything from agriculture to technologies of organized violence, by which I mean governments, to like telecommunications, pronunciation, and medicine, like medical such stuff. So eventually, governments may be formed by a larger small group of private individuals, right? Governing operations include everything from court systems with armed mercenaries like law enforcement agencies to churches and mass media and guilds like, you know, the Goldsmith Guild or the Carpenter Union, and, you know, that kind of thing. So govern references influence, especially systematic influence of certain groups of people, the governing or the government, over other people or towards other people, the governed. So some governing operations involve consent, such as chambers of commerce with voluntary membership and self-created regulations, while others may involve coercion, deception and tyranny, such as colonial imperialism. Okay, so with all of that clear, consider that the various government operations are all collaborative human behaviors, right? They're all groupified things, and all of the variations specifically form in response to a new development in private human activity. So there's a new development in private human activities, and then the groups of people govern like that. Okay, so when you have a new technology like happen, discovered, and then there's the new occurrence, right? The automobile collision. Then the governments respond to, well, how are we going to like license and regulate the government, the automobile manufacturers and the automobile travelers and all that. So simply put, governments respond. Even when governments lead, though, that leadership is simply a relatively new response to some new development, such as the discovery of fossil fuels or radio technology or telescopes or the wheel, or even natural developments such as a hurricane or volcanic eruption or drought or snowstorm or flood or whatever, right? So governments respond. Governments are not all powerful. Government did not invent the sun or discover humans. Governments are simply a particular group of people. Within governments, some people may, and many people may argue and struggle like, what should we do? Right? That's the kind of thing that governments talk about is, what should we do? Between governments, and then, also governments do stuff, of course, right? After they argue. All right, so between governments, like the same thing occurs, a conflict between local governments and national governments, or conflict between two or more adjacent local governments that, for instance, all border the same body of water, and they're like, well, what should we do in terms of the quality of the water and how we manage like water coming out and stuff going in like chemicals and fishing and things like that. So now, properly understanding the role of governing operations such as chambers of commerce and nations and churches and tribes and fraternities and cartels, got all that, one can recognize the relevance of several possible ways of relating to various government operations. One may wish to initiate or form government operations as well as lead existing operations of governing, or comply with existing operations of governing, or simply focus away from various existing operations of governing because it just gets all repetitive at some point. So focusing away from the particular form of responsive governments known as human governments, one may focus instead on other kinds of human groups or on humanity as a whole. Or even on one's own personal choices, behaviors, conversations, and possible results, right? So for instance, in regard to finances, what are one's priorities and values? What are one's existing assets and one's expected revenues, such as accounts receivable? What relationships are available for partnering and new explorations? These are the kinds of questions that I might ask. So how can we learn about our own financial alternatives? By observing the financial practices of governments or any other person, and then the results that they get. What results can we notice as predictable for various methods and various patterns of conversation, patterns of relating? Within this context, it's probable that at some point there will be some degree of relevance to the operations of various governing officials, like interacting with them, partnering with them, perhaps including to complain about certain things we want them to change, or to promote a certain proposal or protest something that they may not have even done yet that is proposed or pending, whatever. So that's fine. But rather than experiencing all government practices in the context of a complicated issue for argument and like trying to figure out how do we fix things and all that, or a conflict or a dilemma or desperation, one may simply experience various possible governing practices simply as like alternatives, like there are different kinds of ways of governing such. So there's simply different possibilities, simply as available resources or opportunities, or as Jim Rohn might say, simply. See, because there's different things that go on, and just to see the different things that go on as just different things that go on, not things that are right or wrong or shouldn't be or things we got to fix and such. They're just like available. It's like, is pink better than yellow? No, pink is distinct from yellow, just like that. Okay, so we can learn from governments. We can partner with and participate in governments. We can oppose them or form new ones, whatever. We can also be responsible for governing ourselves well, at least in regard to certain choices that we may be the only ones exploring. That's fine. That means we're like the leaders if other people follow us after we do it first. So we can study patterns of cause and effect on many levels, from gravity to biology to solar radiation to regulatory law enforcement, by armed mercenaries directed by bankruptcy court judges or warlords or popes or whatever. Like those are just like yellow and pink. like just yellow and pink, right? It's yellow and pink. All right, so governments rule whatever governments rule and nothing less or more. Every government official to ever operate on this planet might influence the financial choices and financial results of any individual today, including other governing officials, right? I've been a bureaucrat too. I've been a government employee. I've been a bureaucrat. So rules and precedents from hundreds or thousands of years ago may still apply today and tomorrow. However, something entirely new is also always possible. So choose whether you accept responsibility now or instead attribute responsibility to some external influence, which could be the sun, it could be the national government, it could be the OPEC or the IRS or the Republicrats or whatever. So choose whether you accept responsibility now or instead attribute or like project or reject responsibility and put it on some external influence, the devil. So both are entirely valid. Like you can accept responsibility or project it. Either one's all right. I mean, you know, you really could do either one. So both are entirely valid. However, I just said entirely.
You did.
Or did I say entirely? I said entirely. That was correct.
Yeah.
That's what I meant to say, entirely. So both are entirely valid perspectives. You could like reject responsibility or you could accept it. That's pretty much it. Recept it or eject it. Okay, yellow or pink. So, however, the results available by accepting responsibility or rejecting responsibility, externalizing responsibility, they may be quite distinct. Like the results that you get, like could be like different, like pink and yellow, or not like pink and yellow. They could actually be like important to you. What results you get? All right. Stop.